We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
Subscribe right now and hit that notification bell, because what the FBI just activated in the Nancy Guthrie investigation is not just a new lead, it is a weapon. A forensic weapon so powerful that it has pulled killers out of shadows after 40 years of silence. A weapon that does not care if a suspect has never been arrested, does not care if they have never left a fingerprint in a database, does not care if they wiped down every surface, burned every piece of clothing, and disappeared off the face of the earth. Because this weapon does not need them, it only needs one of their relatives. And somewhere in America right now, a cousin, a sibling, a parent has already handed investigators everything they need without even knowing it. The FBI has deployed investigative genetic genealogy in the search for Nancy Guthrie. And the world's leading DNA expert just looked into the camera and said 4 words directly to the person who took her. You will be identified. Let us start at the moment this investigation hit its first major wall. Because this story does not begin with genetic genealogy. It begins with the moment genetic genealogy became the only option left. When Nancy Guthrie's home was processed in the first days after her disappearance, investigators found something significant. Blood on the front porch, Nancy's blood, confirmed through DNA analysis, and then something else. DNA from inside and around the property that did not belong to Nancy Guthrie. Did not belong to any family member, did not belong to anyone who had been identified as having legitimate access to that home. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed it publicly. He said, "We believe that we may have some DNA there that may be our suspect, but we won't know that until that DNA is separated, sorted out, maybe admitted to CODIS, maybe through genetic genealogy." There it was. The first public mention. CODIS first. Then, if that failed, genetic genealogy. CODIS failed CODIS. The Combined DNA Index System is the FBI's national DNA database. It contains nearly 27 million profiles, more than 19 million convicted offenders, over 1 million forensic samples. A database that has aided more than 750,000 investigations since its creation in the 1990s. When investigators get a DNA sample from a crime scene, the first move is always CODIS. It is fast, and the FBI says results typically come back within 24 hours of receiving a sample, and when it hits hard. But CODIS has one fundamental limitation. It only contains DNA from people who have already been in the system. Arrests, convictions, previous contact with law enforcement serious enough to require a DNA sample. If the suspect in the Nancy Guthrie case has never been arrested for a qualifying offense, if they have managed to stay off law enforcement's radar their entire life, then their DNA profile does not exist in CODIS, and a search will return nothing. That is exactly what happened. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed it. DNA recovered from a glove found approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home, a glove that appeared to match the gloves worn by the masked suspect in the doorbell camera footage, was submitted to CODIS. No match. The glove DNA also did not match the DNA found at the property. 2 separate DNA sources. 2 separate CODIS searches. 2 separate dead ends. And that is when investigators made the call that every forensic expert watching this case had been waiting for. They turned to genetic genealogy. If you are not familiar with investigative genetic genealogy, and after this video you will never forget it, here is what it is and why it changes everything. Investigative genetic genealogy, or IGG, is a forensic process that takes a DNA sample from an unknown suspect and uses it to build a family tree, working backwards through biological relatives until investigators can identify the individual who left that DNA at the crime scene. It does not require the suspect's DNA to be in any law enforcement database. It does not require the suspect to have ever interacted with the criminal justice system. It only requires that somewhere in the vast commercial DNA databases that now hold tens of millions of profiles, a relative of that suspect has submitted their own DNA for ancestry research. A third cousin who did a 23andMe test to find out if they were part Irish. A grandparent who submitted to Ancestry DNA to build a family tree for their grandchildren. a sibling who used a consumer kit as a Christmas gift. None of those people know they may be connected to a violent crime. None of them consented to their DNA being used this way in any explicit sense, but their profiles sit in commercial databases, and from those profiles, from the shared genetic segments between a distant relative and an unknown suspect, investigators can begin to reconstruct a family tree that eventually leads to one name, one face, one address. C.C. Moore is the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, one of the nation's most prominent forensic genetic genealogy laboratories. She is among the most respected practitioners of this science in the world. She went on the Today Show, she looked directly into the camera, and she said the sentence that every person watching this case needed to hear. She said, "If I was the kidnapper, I would be extremely concerned right now, because using investigative genetic genealogy, he will be identified. It's just a matter of time. Just a matter of time. Not if, not maybe, not possibly, matter of time." Now let us talk about what this process actually looks like, because the technical reality of how genetic genealogy works is more remarkable than most people understand. David Middleman, genetic genealogist and CEO of Othram Inc., one of the premier forensic DNA laboratories in the country, laid out the process precisely. When a DNA sample is collected, it is first processed to generate a profile. That profile is converted into code, a digital representation of the genetic markers present in that sample. The profile is then uploaded to one of the publicly accessible genealogy databases. Unlike CODIS, which looks at approximately 20 specific genetic locations, forensic genetic genealogy analyzes a far larger portion of the genome, examining 500,000 genetic markers across the entire DNA strand. This is crucial, because the more markers you examine, the more distant the relative you can detect. With 500,000 markers, you are not just looking for close family. You can detect third cousins, fourth cousins, even fifth cousins, people who share as little as 1% of their DNA with the unknown suspect. From there, investigators begin building a family tree around every matching profile. They use public records, birth certificates, marriage records, obituaries, census data, social media to map out the branches of each family, until they identify individuals who match the known physical profile of the suspect. The right age, the right geographical location, the right background. They narrow it down. They narrow it further. And then, just like with the Golden State Killer and Brian Kohberger, they get a name. At that point, the genetic genealogy has done its job. It has provided an investigative lead. Traditional detective work takes over. Surveillance, discarded DNA collection, warrant for a direct sample confirmation. Middleman described the outcome in terms that leave no ambiguity. He said, in the worst case scenario, it will connect you to a very close relative. And the best case scenario gets it to your person. Worst case, boom, they find a close relative and close the net from there. Best case, they find the suspect directly. Either way, the net closes. But before we go any further, we need to talk about the obstacles, because this investigation is not a straight line, and the challenges facing investigators in the genetic genealogy phase of this case are real, documented, and significant. The first challenge is the DNA sample itself. Sheriff Nanos confirmed that the DNA recovered from Nancy Guthrie's property is a mixed sample, meaning it contains genetic material from more than one person. Mixed DNA is, in the words of C.C. Moore, common in violent crimes, but it is also harder to work with. Susanna Ryan, laboratory director at Pure Gold Forensics, a private forensic DNA laboratory, explained the complexity precisely. She said an ideal DNA sample would have a single source profile. However, labs can also work with samples that have two contributors as long as most of the sample is from a potential perpetrator. The labs could work with a mixture of, let's say, 80% contributor A to 20% contributor B, as long as the potential perpetrator is the 80% component. If it's the other way around, they usually can't do much with that type of mixture in terms of the downstream genealogical research. In plain language, if the suspect is the primary contributor to the mixed DNA at Nancy's home, they can work with it. If they are the minor contributor, the process becomes exponentially more difficult. The lab has reported challenges. Sheriff Nanos confirmed it himself. He told NBC News that the lab, which received the DNA, reported challenges with the sample. He did not elaborate on what those challenges were, but he added something that matters. He said, "Our lab also knows that the technology is moving so fast. The technology is moving so fast. That is not a deflection. That is a statement of fact. Forensic DNA science in 2026 can work with sample sizes that would have been considered unusable 5 years ago. 9 nanograms of DNA, a nearly invisible quantity, was enough to identify a suspect in a cold case that had sat dormant for decades. The sample challenges in the Guthrie case are real, but they are not insurmountable." The second challenge is the database problem, and this one has generated enormous controversies because it exposes a fundamental conflict between corporate privacy policy and the urgency of an active kidnapping investigation. The 3 largest consumer DNA databases in the United States, Ancestry23 and Mio and MyHeritage, together hold profiles for more than 50 million people. 50 million potential connections to the suspect's family tree. Law enforcement cannot access any of them. All 3 companies have policies that bar law enforcement from searching their databases without explicit user consent or, in some cases, a court-ordered warrant. And even then, they have fought those warrants aggressively. The genetic genealogy expert Anne Ray Venter, the scientist who identified the Golden State Killer, described the frustration of this limitation in direct terms. She said, "The 2 databases that we're allowed to use are 2 of the smallest databases. If we could be using Ancestry or 23andMe or even MyHeritage, those databases are huge. You're talking about 10 to 20 times as many people. If you're working on something like the Kohberger case or the Nancy Guthrie case, suddenly time is really important. It's adding time to what was already a very time-onerous procedure." The databases available to law enforcement for IgG searches are GED Match, Family Tree DNA, and DNA Justice. Together, they hold fewer than 2 million combined profiles, 2 million versus 50 million. The difference is not just numerical, it is the difference between potentially solving this case in hours or solving it in months. CeCe Moore, who has championed this technology for years, went further. She made a direct public appeal. She urged anyone who has DNA data stored in any of the large commercial platforms, Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, to download their raw data file and upload it voluntarily to GED Match or Family Tree DNA. A simple act, free of charge. Takes about 20 minutes, and it could be the act that identifies the person who took Nancy Guthrie. Moore said it clearly, if they have deep roots in the United States, it could be minutes, it could be a few hours. But if it's somebody who doesn't have connections to the U.S. in their tree in more recent generations, then it could take much longer. The third challenge, on and arguably the most politically explosive, is what happened with the DNA evidence before it ever reached a genetic genealogy lab. Othram Inghuskur is a Texas-based forensic genetic genealogy laboratory. It was instrumental in the Brian Kohberger case. It has helped crack hundreds of other cases across the country, including cases that sat cold for decades. When news broke that the Pima County Sheriff's Department had sent DNA evidence from Nancy Guthrie's home to a laboratory in Florida, DNA Labs International, a traditional forensic lab, Othram co-founder Kristen Middleman went public with her reaction, and her reaction was not diplomatic. She said, "This is so devastating." Then she said something that rocked the investigative community watching this case. She said, DNA Labs International is a traditional forensic lab that consumes evidence to make an STR profile, so I don't understand why it didn't go to Quantico, since they can do this better and faster than anyone, and they have a pipeline to flip it immediately to inferring identity with us. Consumes evidence. Traditional forensic labs conducting STR, short tandem repeat. Analysis use up portions of the physical DNA sample in the testing process. Once that sample is consumed, it is gone. You cannot get it back. If the sample had gone directly to the FBI laboratory at Quantico, they could have conducted the analysis and then immediately transferred the resulting profile to a forensic genetic genealogy lab like Othram. The same pipeline that cracked the Kohberger case, instead it went to a Florida lab first, was evidence consumed? Was the sample degraded? Was the window for ideal analysis narrowed? These are questions that remain unanswered in the public record. But Otham's public statement makes clear what the forensic genealogy community thinks about that decision. Devastating. Now let us talk about the cases where this technology worked, because the history of investigative genetic genealogies is not a history of theory, it is a history of results. And those results are staggering. The Golden State Killer terrorized California for 12 years, at least 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, over 100 home invasions. He was a ghost. For decades, investigators had his DNA but could not match it to any name. He was so careful, so methodical, that law enforcement genuinely believed he might never be caught. In 2018, genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter uploaded the killer's DNA profile to Getty Match. She found matches to third and fourth cousins. She spent 63 days building a family tree around those matches. At 3 in the morning, alone at her computer, she landed on a name: Joseph James D'Angelo, a retired police officer, a grandfather, living quietly in Citrus Heights, California. Investigators followed him to a store. They collected his discarded DNA from a tissue. The match was confirmed in 4 hours. D'Angelo was arrested. He pleaded guilty to all charges in 2020. He is currently serving multiple life terms without parole. Then came Brian Kohberger. 4 college students murdered at the University of Idaho in November 2022. The case gripped the nation. No suspect, no obvious motive. A killer who had moved efficiently and left almost nothing behind. Investigators found DNA on a knife sheath at the crime scene. Othram, the same company whose co-founder slammed the handling of the Guthrie evidence, generated a DNA profile from that sheath. They built a family tree through GED matches. The trail led to Kohberger's father in Pennsylvania. Investigators retrieved a Q-tip from the garbage outside the father's home, confirmed the familial connection, identified Brian Kohberger as the primary suspect. Kohberger was arrested in January 2023. He was sentenced in July 2025 to 4 consecutive life sentences. A pizza crust, a tissue, a Q-tip from someone's garbage. These are not dramatic forensic breakthroughs, they are mundane objects, and they delivered justice in cases that had no other path forward. The Nancy Guthrie case now sits in this lineage. There is a detail in this investigation that has not received nearly enough attention. CNN has reported something critical in their evidence tracker for this case. One photograph released by the FBI, separate from the doorbell camera clips, shows the suspect at Nancy's property without the backpack and without the gun holster he was carrying in the other images. A source told CNN that photo was taken on a separate day. A separate day. Investigators now believe the suspect may have visited Nancy Guthrie's home on multiple occasions before the night of her abduction. This matters for genetic genealogy in a direct and specific way, because every visit to a property is an opportunity to leave biological material. A hair fiber, skin cells transferred to a surface, respiratory droplets, trace DNA from contact with any object. If the suspect was at Nancy's home on more than one occasion, scoping the property, studying camera positions, learning her routine, then the quantity and quality of DNA available to investigators may be greater than what has been publicly discussed. Mixed samples, partial profiles, but potentially multiple deposits across multiple visits. The lab challenges Sheriff Nanos described may not be the final word on what forensic analysis can eventually extract from that scene. Here is what happens next, and this is the part that should matter most to every person watching. The genetic genealogy process is underway, the laboratory work is ongoing, the FBI's team, which according to ABC News includes 200 dedicated genetic genealogy agents, is involved. CeCe Moore predicted the timeline with specificity. She said, "I have worked on cases for years." However, I don't think this case will take that long because of the large amount of resources being dedicated to it. I would suspect the FBI genetic genealogy team would be brought in if it takes too long, and they have 200 agents. She predicted the process would take weeks to months, not years, and she said it one more time in the clearest terms possible. She said if they have deep roots in the United States, this could be identified in minutes. If not, it takes longer, but they will be identified. Minutes. That is the upper boundary of how fast this technology can work when everything lines up. on one end of the spectrum, minutes on the other end, months, but never, never. This technology does not produce never. There is one more angle to this story that deserves to be said. Plainly, the suspect in this case, the masked figure on that doorbell footage, believed they were protected. They wore gloves thick enough that a profiler noted it affected their hand dexterity. They wore a full ski mask. They tilted their head at specific angles to avoid camera geometry. They removed the camera from its mount. They planned this operation with what multiple former FBI agents have described as sophisticated preparation and operational awareness. And somewhere in that planning, somewhere in the calculation of risk, they may have believed that DNA was not a concern. That if they left nothing in the databases, if they had no criminal record, if CODIS returned nothing, they were invisible. They did not account for the aunt who swabbed a cotton stick 3 years ago and mailed it to Ancestry to find out which part of Europe her grandmother came from. They did not account for the second cousin who uploaded their raw DNA file to GED Match just to see what the results would say. They did not account for the brother or the nephew or the distant relative who exists somewhere in those databases. A perfectly innocent person who has no idea that their genetic information is now part of a forensic investigation into the disappearance of an 84-year-old woman from Tucson, Arizona. That is how this technology works. That is why Cece Moore, a woman who has used this exact process to identify hundreds of suspects across hundreds of cases, sat in front of a camera and said without hesitation, he will be identified. Not might be, not could be, will be. If you have any information about the Nancy Guthrie case, any vehicle, any person, any conversation you heard, any behavior that seemed wrong, call 1-800-CALL-FBI right now. $1.2 million is waiting for the tip that brings Nancy home. And if you have a DNA profile stored in Ancestry, 23andMe, or MyHeritage, consider downloading your raw data file and uploading it to GED Match or Family Tree DNA. You may not know who is in your family tree, but the FBI might be very interested in finding out. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. The science is running, the lab is working, the family tree is being built, and the clock is ticking for the person who thought they were invisible. They are not invisible. They never were.